Hi, welcome. My name is Jeff Jensen. I teach political science here at NYU Abu Dhabi, and I have the honor of introducing Daniel Kelly, a professor of philosophy at Purdue University in the US. Dan studied philosophy of mind and moral psychology at Rutgers University, which is one of the preeminent philosophy departments in the US. He also, during his time, managed to survive 2 years as my roommate in New York City in an apartment that has since been deemed unfit for human habitation, which is not a joke. Dan, following his PhD, Dan moved to Purdue University in Indiana in the US. And I'll just briefly say he has written a book titled Yuck. But the book is where he studies the evolution of the emotion disgust and its implications for morality. Dan tonight is going to speak about a different strand of his research, and so I'll now turn it over to Dan Kelly.
Well, thank you, Jeff, for that nice introduction. Thanks to NYU for having me out, and thanks to all of you for coming out to see this talk. Like Jeff said, it's going to be on a slightly different strand of my research. It's going to be on thinking through the moral implications for a recent wave of work in social psychology on what have been called implicit biases. And what I mainly want to think about is how we can or how we should hold ourselves responsible for these sorts of things. So the first thing I want to do is be very upfront that the research I'm presenting today is sort of the combination of certain papers that I've written before with some co-authors. So this is my former graduate student, Natalia Washington, and this is Jules Holroyd. And so a lot of what I'm saying here is the product of collaborations with these two. So the first thing I'll do is sort of situate the discussion and give a very broad gloss of the project here and how I'm conceiving of it, because there's many people working on similar kinds of issues in philosophy right now. So what we, and a lot of times in these slides there will be a we, or I will say we, and that's not the royal we or anything like that. That's because I've presented this before with both of my co-authors, and I want to make sure they get credit for this. So what we wanted to do was think systematically about addressing a certain brand of challenge which arises from this research, which is coming from empirical research, which is coming out of social psychology. So on the one hand, you can think of us trying to figure out the implications for each other of these two bodies of research. On the one hand, there's philosophic theories about moral responsibility. What it is, when we can hold ourselves and other people responsible, when it's reasonable to hold them responsible, blame them for actions which are bad, give them credit for actions which are good. And a lot of time, the philosophic theories, philosophers see themselves as giving more precise elaborations of the norms that govern responsibility, or sort of improving on those norms. But what they're doing a lot of times is sort of reflecting. So their theories are based in intuition. Their theories are based on sort of observation or reflection on our actual social practices. And so they typically presuppose a kind of commonsensical picture of the way the human mind works. It's what's sometimes called folk psychology, the psychological theory of the mind, which the folk use. You don't have to take a psychology class. It's just you think of and explain what people do in terms of their beliefs and their desires. And that's sort of the underlying sources of behavior. And then on the other hand, so that's the one body of research, is the philosophic work on moral responsibility. On the other hand is this sort of, I think of it as a gathering storm. There's a body of research in particularly the one I'm going to talk about today, social psychology, but a lot of different work is sort of putting pressure on that folk psychological picture of the mind. So there's these psychological complexities which are emerging in various ways, and I'll detail some of those. But they're facts about how our minds actually work, which don't fit really easily with the typical commonsensical picture of the mind, or sort of the folk psychological picture of the mind. And a lot of these facts about our mental functioning, or about the sources of our behavior and judgment, they're not only counterintuitive, in that they don't fit well with the intuitive theory of the mind that we sort of use to get through the day, but they're kind of creepy, and how that plays out I'll say in a little bit. So some of our guiding research questions, and again, I have a series of papers on this, so this is with a broad brush at this point. But most generally, just what's the most just and reasonable way to hold or take responsibility for implicit biases, which I'll tell you about those in a bit. But can people be reasonably held responsible for behaviors, for decisions that are influenced by these sort of creepy facts that a lot of us have as a component of our moral psychology. And then given that a lot of what we know about these creepy facts, these implicit biases, is coming out of empirical research, what kind of moral significance should be assigned to it? So I don't think there's this sort of unbridgeable gulf between what ought to be and what is. I think the two have to be thought about in conjunction with each other. So what are some of the ways that the empirical gains in knowledge coming from the psychology should be incorporated into, sort of reflected in our moral norms and our practices? And you might, so the piece of terminology from the title of the talk is moral ecology. So how can we use those gains in self-knowledge, sort of what's coming out of the social psychological research, to sort of actively shape and improve our moral ecology? So that piece of terminology there, moral ecology, is very suggestive. I like it a lot. Part of the reason that it has a lot of utility is it's a little bit vaguer on the edges. But it's a piece of terminology which is in currency in a lot of different discussions. So the moral ecology is, and these are two books which invest heavily and sort of cash out their theses in terms of the moral ecology. But it's a way to talk about sort of the complex cluster of moral norms, the relevant circumstances, the knowledge and epistemological or epistemic content, and just the general texture of the social milieu in which agency and behavior and morality take place. So the aspects that sort of guide and support and enable people to engage in actions and be responsible agents that we usually think take responsibility for their behaviors. So here's an overview of the talk, sort of a map. So I'll return to this at various points so we don't get lost as we go through, so I don't get lost as we go through. So the first part I'll talk a little bit about, so I'll try and get a little bit more precise about the problem or the potential problem here that philosophers have been worrying about. The second part, I'll get a little bit more concrete and do one of these things philosophers do, and I ask you to imagine a kind of science fiction-y scenario and then apply concepts to it, specifically with a hiring committee, and then I'll sort of wrap things up quickly and we can talk about this. So the IB problem, IB stands for, or is short for, implicit bias. So implicit biases are a variety of mental process or a variety of mental entity or a variety of mental state. There's still sort of in the trenches debate exactly how to think about what these things are. But most of what we know, there's piles and piles of data about implicit biases. Most of what we know about them comes from a variety of psychological measures, which are sometimes called indirect measures. So what these are is they're experimental techniques which are ways to sort of probe the contents of someone's mind, which don't presuppose that they have clean introspective access to various mental states, or which don't rely on the veracity of their own self-reports about what they think about various things or how they would react in various situations. Because these are two methods which have their uses, but there's also sort of well-known problems with using that way to figure out what's going on in someone's mind and what's happening there. So the data on implicit biases, there's a variety of these indirect tests. Probably the most famous one, and the one that you can go online and take, about 20 minutes of your time at most, to take one of these tests is called the implicit association test. If you put that in Google, it'll pop right up. The online tests at Harvard, sometimes shortened to the IAT. But I don't want to give you the impression that everything I'm saying here is just based on the results of this one kind of psychological measure. There's a variety of different measures. There's semantic priming. There's a startle eye blink tests. The psychologists are ingenious in the ways they've thought up to sort of probe these things. And the way we're going to conceive of implicit bias, like I said, there's mountains of data on this at this point, and as you might expect, there's also lots of debate over this, the how to interpret that data, what the right kind of models are. So as I was taught in grad school at Rutgers, one of the things you can do if you want to think about the philosophic implications of a body of empirical research is make sure that your philosophic claims don't hang too heavily on just a single study or just a single sort of interpretation of the study. So what I'm going to say here isn't really, really precise, but that's a strategic move. There's certain kinds of textbook facts about implicit bias that I'm going to just pull out, and I can make my case just relying on those being true. That's sort of the stable points in the literature. So you can think of an implicit bias as as a first gloss, an unconscious and automatic, typically negative, certainly the kind that I'm going to talk about today, negative evaluative tendency that lots of people have towards people based on their membership in a particular social group. So There have been demonstrated, sort of there's a lot of different people who harbor implicit biases about gender, so the sort of stereotype that maybe women aren't very good at math, about sexual orientation, about race, about age, about weight, about religion. So there are implicit biases with respect to a lot of these things. To clarify and to make the dialectic clean, I'm just going to talk about racial implicit biases, but I certainly hope a lot of what I have to say would generalize to the rest, but again, it may be that there's different psychological mechanisms underlying the different brands of implicit bias, and that would be interesting to know and think about. So 4 key features of implicit bias that I'll use to make my case and just sort of familiarize you with them. The dissociation, they're covert, they're recalcitrant, and they exhibit a subtle but pervasive effect on a lot of different behavior. So taking those in order. The dissociation is probably the thing that people have heard about implicit biases most know about it, because it's really the thing which makes them kind of creepy, like I said before. So implicit biases have the following psychological character. A single individual, you or me, or anyone else, can at the same time harbor, on the one hand, sort of think of the mind as keeping 2 sets of books with respect to attitudes towards members of a certain social group. Like I said, I'll talk about racial biases. So a single individual can harbor, on the one hand, implicit racial biases, negative evaluative tendencies, and at the very same time, those mental states can coexist with explicit racial attitudes, which are diametrically opposed to them. So on the one hand, a single person can have genuine, explicit views, which are anti-racist, which are egalitarian, which are, add whatever you want, friendly towards whatever sexual orientation you like, that they sincerely endorse upon reflection. It's not that they're lying to you if you ask them. It's not that they're in the grip of some sort of devious self-deception. It's just they can hold these views very, very genuinely, while at the same time, sort of another part of their mind, the other set of books that their mind keeps, they have implicit biases, negative implicit biases against members of certain races based just on their membership in that racial category. Second textbook fact, that the operation of these implicit biases, or the presence of these implicit biases, can be covert, or typically is covert. So they operate, they activate when you see or interact with a member of whatever social group, member of the race that you have implicit biases toward. They operate outside of consciousness. Not only do they operate outside of consciousness, but they're not easily detectable. So you can't tell if you have implicit biases just by sort of closing your eyes and introspecting really hard. That's not sort of that route to epistemic access of these things is, if not impossible, it's very problematic, or it's difficult to do. So casual self-observation, difficult to find out. So their presence in your own mind can be hard to detect, and their influence on your own thought, your own evaluations and your behavior can be very hard to detect too. Sort of other side of the coin for this, they are recalcitrant. So it's not just that if you have them, you don't thereby know that you have them. It's not just that the mind is opaque to itself in this sense, but they operate without any volitional control. They operate unintentionally. They operate outside of consciousness. So they certainly operate most of the time without volitional control. And sometimes they operate despite volitional control. So there's a lot of ways in which they're recalcitrant. So once you acquire, or once an individual acquires implicit biases towards a certain social group, they're difficult to sort of eradicate. Just coming that you know them and trying to sort of get them out of your mental socks is extremely hard to do. They're much easier to catch than they are to get rid of, is another way to think about it. And then once you have them and they're activated by a particular situation, or a particular interaction with someone in the racial group, it's difficult to completely suppress their expression, either in judgment or behavior. And in fact, it's not only just difficult to completely sort of stop or suppress their expression, attempts to do so, to just use willpower to sort of misdirect or redirect implicit biases, typically fail in a really depressingly wide range of ways. So you have to remain vigilant, but doing so sort of taxes your mental resources. So it can be extremely mentally fatiguing to remain so vigilant and then try and sort of keep yourself from being implicitly biased. And then doing so can actually backfire in a number of different ways. So they can rebound, or they can bring about the wrong sort of reaction from the person that you're trying not to be implicitly biased towards. But I want to flag this issue as well. So when I say they're recalcitrant and they often operate outside of and despite sort of the most intuitive, direct attempts to control them. It's not that they're sort of completely and utterly beyond our control. It's just that the way that we can get a grip on them and sort of mediate or mitigate their influence on our behavior is it's counterintuitive. It's the sort of thing which empirical psychologists have been investigating under the title The Malleability of Implicit Biases. And what they've been finding is there are ways that you can kind of get a grip, that you can control these things, but it's not anything which is intuitive. You sort of have to, you hear about what actually works and what doesn't work, and it's extremely surprising, and it's not what you would think beforehand. And then finally, the subtle but pervasive effects on behavior. So implicit biases can influence judgment and behavior, and there's a good case to be made that it's not just in the laboratory, or it's not just when someone's taking one of these sort of artificial psychological tests, which these indirect tests. So again, mounting pile of evidence, and it's harder to get sort of straightforward evidence about this because in the real world, things get extremely messy, so you have to build the case in various ways. But people, so on the one hand, you can test people to see if they have implicit biases, and on the other hand, you can give them what's called see if they have a weapon bias. So people who have a weapon bias are people who are more likely to misidentify a cell phone as a gun. People who have implicit biases towards, for instance, in the United States, African Americans, if they have implicit biases, they are much more likely to also have a weapons bias, but only when it's an African American who's pulling out a cell phone rather than a gun. Big study on the effect of the racial composition of a referee squad compared to the racial composition of the basketball teams that the referee squad is monitoring and refereeing, found that there are in fact racial differences. Like if the referee squad is predominantly black and the team that if the referee squad is predominantly white and the team that they're monitoring is predominantly black, then you'll find that, again, systematically or to a significant extent, there's more fouls called. And then, so those are kind of snap decisions that you have to make quickly, certainly if you're a referee or a police officer having to make a snap decision about whether or not someone's pulling a gun on you. But there's other body of evidence that suggests that implicit biases also affect judgments that don't have to be made in a snap second, but which can have a little bit more deliberation behind them. So that implicit biases on the part of medical or healthcare providers can actually influence how much and what kind of healthcare is dispensed towards white people, black people, people of other races. Also evidence suggesting that the implicit biases of people who select juries or judges who select juries can systematically influence the racial composition of those juries. And there's an entire depressing genre showing that who gets an interview if you send out resumes into the world and you have the resumes be exactly the same in content, but you just change the name from, for instance, a white-sounding name to a black-sounding name. This is in the United States again. The resumes with the white-sounding name will get considerably more callbacks, even though the content of the resume is exactly the same. And again, I said I'll use this in my thought experiment, but this is a broad genre, so that this has been tweaked and explored in a number of different ways at this point. All right, so those are the textbook facts, sort of the quick overview of what I'm thinking about in terms of implicit bias and the key properties that they have. The other side of the project here is to think a little bit about responsibility, and I'm going to express this in terms of exculpating conditions. So first, why even think that this is a problem? So here's a much quoted passage from one of the preeminent researchers, John Barge, social psychologist who's done a lot of work on priming and stereotyping and implicit bias. This is a body of research. And he made this claim sort of early, and it gets to the heart of the problem. If it were indeed the case, as research appeared to indicate, that stereotyping and biases and priming and all these other things occurs without an individual's awareness or intention, then the implications for society were tremendous, as well as tremendously depressing. Most ominously, how could anyone be held responsible, legally or otherwise, for discriminatory or prejudicial behavior when psychological science had shown such effects to occur unintentionally? So again, this is a psychologist sort of reflecting on his own research, saying there may be a gathering storm here. There might be this problem. As the more we learn about the mind, the more it doesn't look like it says really good things about our capacity to be moral creatures. So this is Jennifer Saul. She's a philosopher. She's also sort of a preeminent figure in the movement of philosophers trying to think systematically about the implications of this research on implicit bias. And one of her early statements is the following. A person should not be blamed for an implicit bias that they are completely unaware of, which results solely from the fact that they live in a sexist or racist culture. Even once they become aware that they are likely to have implicit biases, they do not instantly become able to control their biases, and so they should not be blamed for them. So again, she expresses the same kind of worry, but she goes a little bit further and says, look, if people don't know they have implicit biases, of course you can't blame them for them. So my take-home message here is that I disagree with that. This is what I'm going to try to convince you of by the end of the talk. That this is wrong, at least this sometimes is wrong. So the sort of take-home message, the core point here is that there are, in fact, circumstances when people can and should be blamed for implicit bias-influenced actions. So for my claim, it's not just that they have implicit biases. It's for the behaviors which are influenced by those implicit biases, even if they are completely unaware of those implicit biases. Moreover, maybe importantly, sort of the way that I'm going to make this case, some of the implications are that the range of circumstances in which this is true and which it's reasonable to hold people responsible for behaviors that are influenced by implicit biases, even if they don't know they have them. The range of cases where this is true is growing because the moral ecology in which we hold ourselves responsible is itself evolving and can evolve in ways that we shape and direct. Okay, so what we're not considering, so if those of you out here who might know something about sort of the traditional philosophic problem of free will and moral responsibility, so we're in that territory with this research project, but I'm not looking at what you might think of as global challenges to free will or global challenges to the idea that any of our actions are in fact the sort of thing we should be held morally responsible for. So there's these sort of global challenges or these sweeping challenges. Traditionally, they come from physics, and the worry is if we live in a deterministic universe, then all of our behaviors aren't caused by us. They're caused just by atoms in the void following laws. Not worrying about that kind of problem or issue for moral responsibility. A little bit closer to home, certain philosophers and actually more than philosophers, the psychologists themselves have been claiming that what we're finding in cognitive neuroscience actually shows something similar, this sort of global threat to moral responsibility, that none of our actions are ever the sorts of things that we should hold ourselves morally responsible for, because ultimately they're not ever in our control. It's your brain's fault, or there's a sense in which whatever behavior you engage in was caused by elements of your brain which never get run through your deliberative capacities. It's just all sort of unconscious activation by neural activity. So we're not worried about these global kinds of threats or the kind that the philosophers are worried about. So John Doris has been working a lot on this. Where we do start is with, again, sort of an observation in the way the moral ecology seems to work. So this assumption built into our current ordinary sort of everyday norms and practices that we all engage in a lot of behaviors, and some of them we hold ourselves and each other responsible for, but sometimes we don't. Sometimes we let ourselves off the hook, or sometimes we say, look, it wasn't my fault. So what I'm going to do now is sort of cash out how to think about that. So here's a concrete case to start with. Say Nico, and the piece of behavior that she engages in is that she eats all the cookies that her roommate made. She knows that her roommate made them, especially for tomorrow's bake sale, but Nico just goes ahead and eats them because she was hungry. That's the sort of situation which you would, think you would definitely be justified blaming her for doing something which was sort of nasty and non-compassionate and immoral. But consider a similar case where we wouldn't blame Nico. So let's say she eats all of those cookies. She knew that her roommate had made them especially for tomorrow's bake sale, but she did it when she was sort of sleepwalking. She was in a somnambulant daze. This is the kind of thing where you might wake her up the next day and say, did you eat all the cookies? And she says, yeah, but I was sleepwalking. I didn't know what I was doing, right? So you sort of think it's not her fault. There's a reason to exculpate her there. So for those actions, and again, I was just sort of pumping some intuitions with a concrete case there, but to get a little bit more systematic about it, for those actions where we typically wouldn't hold someone responsible in the current context of our moral ecology, what we'll do is we'll say that they satisfy an exculpating condition. So the person is exculpated because of this condition has been satisfied. So traditionally, I'm not making a claim that these are the only two kinds of exculpating conditions, but traditionally two of the most important ones, or way to understand two of the most important ones, are that they center on knowledge on the one hand and control on the other. So to get, again, a little bit more systematic, I'm setting this up because I'm going to use it to analyze cases as we go. An agent is exculpated from having done X, eat cookies, hit someone with a car, what have you, if she didn't know that she did X, she didn't know that she was doing it, or that she didn't know why she was doing it in some robust sense, or she didn't have the right kind of control over her behavior when she did action X. So she was constrained or coerced in some way, or she just lacked the proper control over her behavior. So in addition to this idea, which should be recognizable, that we have these kind of exculpating conditions built into our moral practices, but in addition to these exculpating conditions, there's also sometimes where there's exception clauses. So we're sort of 2 steps in at this point. So when there's an exculpation condition which is satisfied, but there's also an exception clause which is satisfied, then we revert to holding the person responsible, to blaming them for what they did if what they did was bad, or giving them credit for what they did if what they did was good. So again, take Nico eating all of her roommate's cookies. Let's say she did it while she was sleepwalking around. She was in some ambulant daze. But in this case, to elaborate this a little more, she took a bunch of Ambien before she went to bed that night. And let's say every time Nico takes a bunch of Ambien, she just goes to town on whatever's in the refrigerator and whatever's in the kitchen. And this should sound familiar as well. So in that case, you can imagine the conversation between the roommate and Nico. Nico would be like, I was sleepwalking. It's not my fault. I didn't know what I was doing. And the roommate would justifiably be saying, every time you eat Ambien, you sort of do this. You're responsible for putting yourself in a condition where it's predictable something bad is going to happen. I mean, this kind of case should parallel the way we think about drunk drivers when they do something bad, right? So you take yourself, you induce a certain kind of drug on yourself, you lose control of what you do and you do something bad. Yeah, it's true that you didn't have control over the car, but it's your fault that you didn't have control over the car. So again, to get systematic and show how the framework's going to work here. So you have these exculpating conditions, and then you have the exception clauses. And in the case of Nico, with this last iteration of the Nico case, yeah, she's responsible. She does, in fact, satisfy that initial kind of, or those two in this case, exculpation conditions, but she also satisfies the exception clauses. So we revert back to saying, yeah, it's her fault. She was responsible for that. She should be blamed. And if it's a situation where punishment is available, she should be punished as well. All right, so the problem, returning to the issue of implicit bias, is, well, you might think that there's sort of this, what I think of as a neat alignment between the core features of these creepy facts about our psychology, these implicit biases, and these two sort of main exculpating conditions when it comes to moral responsibility. So the two main exculpating conditions centered on knowledge and control, and these two key features of implicit bias, on the one hand, they're covert. So it's very easy to have these things and not know it. It's very easy to have them. Like, you can't just introspect and figure out if you have them because they're not easily detectable via that means. And you can be influenced by them without knowing it. Likewise, they're not under the sort of typical voluntary control that a lot of our mental states are, or a lot of the behaviors caused by our mental states are. They can be difficult to completely suppress. You can't just sort of wish or make some mental effort and get them out of your moral economy or your psychological economy. And then, again, they often operate not only without, but sometimes despite attentional and conscious control. So the depiction of the problem, the sort of IB problem here, you got these two core exculpating conditions, knowledge and control. You got these two key features of implicit bias, and it looks like they just perfectly line up with each other. So you might be worried that the cognitive monster here is just that, well, we harbor these things within ourselves, and it's going to be difficult to say anything about why we should ever hold ourselves reasonably responsible for them. All right, so moving on to the next section. Get a little bit more concrete here. And again, this is the thought experiment where we get a little bit science fiction-y, but just roll with me. All right, 3 concrete cases to think about. So first, have a person who is, I just think of them as an earnest, old school, straightforward racist. So the straightforward racist, represented by the bad guy from The Simpsons, has implicit racial biases. So he's implicitly, I'm going to go with the sort of stereotypic American example. He's implicitly racially biased against African Americans or against black people. But he doesn't suffer from the dissociation that a lot of people do. So his implicit biases, his sort of negative evaluative tendencies are perfectly aligned. They sort of smoothly integrate with his explicit attitudes, what he tells you if you asked him, or what he would say if he was sipping on an old-fashioned at the country club surrounded by his friends, where he says what he actually thinks. So he's aware of his explicit racial biases. He's able and willing to articulate them when pressed in the right situation. He endorses them upon reflection. He acts on them without compunction. All right, so that's the psychological profile of him. Second one is Jane, what I'm going to call Jane Doe, and this is where the science fiction element enters. So you're going to imagine that Jane Doe exists, we're going to peg her to about 1980. So Jane Doe has this dissociation that seems to be characteristic and kind of creepy, or at least extremely unsettling about implicit biases. So she's her explicit attitudes, that one set of books that she keeps, she's anti-racist, she's pro-equality, she's pro-egalitarianism, and again, she's not lying, she's not sort of involved in characteristic cases of denial or self-deception. She genuinely holds those views. She genuinely means it. She can truthfully articulate them. When she's asked to endorse what her actual values are, these are the ones that she talks about upon reflection. But she's got this other set of books, and they're sort of diametrically opposed from those. She's not aware of that she has implicit biases, though she does. She doesn't know that she harbors them in her own psychology. But because it's 1980, she basically doesn't know about the very existence. She doesn't have a concept of implicit bias. She hasn't heard of the very idea of implicit biases or this potential dissociation at all. So the difference between her and the earnest old school racist is that if she knew that she had these implicit biases, and I've sort of talked to people and watched them go through this unsettling, like slightly horrified, having to incorporate this into their self-image. But if she knew, if there was a way that you could present her, show her that she has these implicit biases, she wouldn't endorse them. She would sincerely disavow the biases themselves, the behaviors that they've influenced, and she would acknowledge that in those cases where her judgments or her behaviors had been sort of influenced by those implicit biases, by her own lights, something had gone wrong. So she's falling short of her own standards. She's not acting in ways which correctly express her ideals. All right, third case, John Doe. And John Doe doesn't live in 1980. John Doe lives today. Right? So John Doe has basically the same psychological profile as Jane Doe. He genuinely has these explicit anti-racist, pro-egalitarian, pro-equality views, truthfully articulates them. It's what he endorses upon reflection, but he harbors implicit biases as well. He's not aware of, he doesn't know that he has any implicit biases. He's sort of ignorant about this fact about himself, that he suffers from this kind of dissociation. But it's 2016, and Joe is he's heard of the concept before. I've heard something about implicit biases from a colleague, or maybe I heard something on NPR. He just hasn't checked to see if he has those implicit biases himself, so he takes no precautions, he makes no judgments. But importantly, he's not like the earnest old school racist. If he did know, if he was sort of presented with this fact about himself, he would be sort of horrified, he would be unsettled, because he wouldn't endorse any of those implicit biases. If he could be shown that certain of his judgments or behaviors had been influenced by the implicit biases, something had gone wrong by his own lights, by his own standards. He was falling short of those standards. He wasn't expressing his own ideals. All right, so we got the cast of characters, we got these three people. And now the scenario I'm going to ask you to imagine, and again, the science fiction element here, somehow, whatever imaginative gymnastics you have to engage in, they're all on a hiring committee. So they're all on a hiring committee, and something like the following happens. They each sort of get the big packet of resumes for the job. They go through whatever month and a half long process is involved in assessing those resumes. It involves sorting, decision processes. A lot of these are conscious, they're explicit, there's deliberate reasoning. But of course, all three of them have these implicit biases, so their sorting and their judgments about who should get a call back and who shouldn't is unknowingly, in all three cases, influenced by their implicit biases. And then what happens is what this genre of study has shown happens again and again and again, is that even though there are lots of equally well-qualified candidates from a variety of different racial or ethnic backgrounds in the application pool, sometimes maybe even resumes which are identical or very close to identical, the outcome is that the committee ends up only interviewing people with or resumes with white-sounding names. And of course, whoever gets the job is someone with a white-sounding name. So the question is, who's responsible for this? Something's gone wrong here. The way that I've described the situation is that there was a lot of equally or better qualified, equally qualified resumes in there, but only people from one kind of racial group or only people with names that sounded like they were from one particular racial group, got the goodies, made it to the interview stage. So how blameworthy, if we're going to partition out blame here for what's gone wrong, how blameworthy is each member of the committee? So the uninteresting case, I think, is Smithers here. Is the, no, not Smithers, Burns, the earnest old school racist. I think he's sort of just want to say this to set it aside. He's straightforwardly responsible. He's going to bear a heavy brunt of the blame. Why? Well, he knows what he's doing when he sorts out the resumes and says, and sort of makes the case that you should only, or the hiring committee should only give callbacks to the ones with white-sounding names. He doesn't know that he's being influenced by implicit biases, but if he was shown that, he would be happy about it. All right, fine. My implicit sort of automatic evaluative tendencies are completely in line with my explicit ones. Yay me, I'm a whole person, right? So he would endorse what happened if he could be shown it. And again, so he's expressing his values and they are being expressed in the outcome. The interesting case to us is the comparison between Jane and John Doe. So the way we describe them, the way I describe them is that certainly individually, or for the most part, they have largely the same psychological profile, but are they equally responsible? Or how do we compare the amount of blame that each one deserves for this morally problematic outcome? Well, the intuition that when we were thinking about this was John Doe has more responsibility, or if you don't think responsibility comes in grades, he's responsible and he deserves much more of the blame than Jane does. So in a nutshell, yeah, neither one of them knew, the way we described it, neither one of them knew that they had implicit biases. Neither would endorse the influence of those biases on the outcomes, but what we're going to say is John should have known better. He should have taken the appropriate steps against this particular outcome in a way that Jane just couldn't have. So why is this the case? Again, that's the intuition, and then try and extract it a little bit and think more systematically about it. So developing that intuition, what happens here? Well, it doesn't seem like, in any of the three cases, bypassing is an issue. So bypassing is one of the concepts that philosophers use to think about the potential threats to moral responsibility coming from the psychology. So the worry is, well, whatever's happening when we do conscious deliberation or when we make a conscious decision, that actually doesn't have anything to do with the sources of our behavior. All the machinery bypasses deliberation, bypasses consciousness. Doesn't seem like there's a plausible case to be made that here, in my thought experiment, what happens is bypassing. Because in the case of the hiring committee, it doesn't look like anyone's deliberation was really bypassed. And this is in part because these weren't snap decisions. It could be the case that consciousness is bypassed when an NBA referee has to decide whether or not someone committed a foul in a split second, or if a police officer has to decide whether or not someone has a gun or a cell phone in a split second. That could just be that consciousness gets bypassed. But in this case, you would need a much greater argument to get to the conclusion that in the sort of temporally smeared out decision-making process that is a hiring committee, that all the conscious reflection was just purely epiphenomenal. Again, that would take a much stronger argument that we're willing to countenance here. Rather, again, it seems like what happens in this case is, to the extent that implicit biases are influencing the machinery of decision, it's kind of like this subtle thumb on the scales of decision. It's getting in there. It's contributing causally to the assessment of the different CVs and resumes, but it's not just completely bypassing deliberation. What it might be doing is corrupting deliberation or giving an illegitimate input to deliberation, but it's not just completely bypassing it. So, second, developing that intuition. Here's a case to think about, and this is one which really resonates when I give this to other teachers. how many of you teachers, but maybe it'll resonate. So imagine you have a clueless student who fails to show up for a midterm exam, but then comes in and sort of begs for mercy, throws himself on the mercy of the court, and says, look, I didn't know we had the midterm. I totally forgot about it. I didn't know that the midterm was on Tuesday. Please, please, please let me take it again. It wasn't my fault. I just didn't know. So in cases like that, clearly what the student is doing in this sort of framework we have is making an appeal to that kind of exculpation condition. Look, I didn't know. You shouldn't blame me. I shouldn't be held responsible. Let me retake the midterm. But in this case, and maybe in an interesting way, in an irrelevant way, so what I'm going to say is, yeah, ignorance doesn't excuse. The exculpation clause is in fact satisfied, so the student's correct that she didn't know. That's straightforward. But the exception clause is also satisfied. She should have known, or he should have known. It was his responsibility for knowing what was on the syllabus and when the day of the midterm was. And why I think this might be useful to say is not everyone has to know that. It's not the responsibility of every person out there or every citizen of a particular country to know when the midterm is for a particular class. But it's your responsibility if you're in the class. So you sort of inherit duties, you inherit responsibilities to know about certain things in virtue of occupying a certain social role. These sorts of responsibilities or these sorts of duties don't need to be evenly distributed, and they can certainly change depending on what social role one occupies and the structure of those social roles in the larger moral ecology. So, again, sort of walking through the three people we have. The uncontroversial case should be the earnest old school racist. He's blameworthy in this case. March through the different ways he might appeal to an exculpation. He probably wouldn't because he would be fine with the outcome, but if he did want to claim that it wasn't his fault, not a good case to be made that he's exculpated because of bypassing, not a good case to be made that he's exculpated because there was unreasonable pressure or he was coerced or some other control-based condition, and not a good case to be made that he was exculpated because of ignorance because he had full knowledge of his explicit racial biases and was acting out those values. So he's blameworthy, which is good because the way we've set up the sort of analytic framework, we're getting the right answer or the intuitively correct answer. So how about Jane Doe? Well, march through the different ways she might be exculpated again. Is she exculpated because of bypassing? I'm going to say no. Is she exculpated because of some sort of coercion or unreasonable pressure or lack of control? We're going to say no. But is she exculpated because of ignorance? And in this case, we're sympathetic to that kind of move. So given the psychological facts, the way we described what happened to Jane, together with the social role she occupied, she's on this hiring committee, and the relevant content of her moral ecology, the epistemic environment at 1980, the relevant factor is that no one knew anything about implicit biases back then. The research didn't really pick up in earnest until the late 90s late 80s and mid 90s. So she in fact satisfies that ignorance-based exculpating condition. She wasn't aware that she had implicit biases. She wasn't aware that or how they were affecting her deliberations about the CVs and her assessment of them. So why isn't it reasonable to blame Jane? Well, she couldn't be reasonably expected to know, so there's no exception clause being satisfied her. She's not like the student who does in fact satisfy the ignorance-based exculpating condition, but also satisfies the exception clause. She's not like that. So again, the reason this is so is broadly a function of her context. It's not necessarily what's going on inside her head, though to some extent it is. It's also taking into account what's happening outside her head in her moral ecology. So again, sort of the collective, the ambient, the cultural state of ignorance with respect to just all implicit biases in 1980. We just didn't know anything about them. So there wasn't widespread knowledge in her moral ecology. Now, again, the comparison case here is John Doe, who's not 1980. He's present day, 2016. Is he exculpated via bypassing? Not a good case to be made there. Is he exculpated because of coercion or some sort of unreasonable pressure? Not a good case to be made there. But is he exculpated because of ignorance? In this case, the difference is no. So again, the relevant slight differences in his psychology, it's that he's in the present day. He is in fact implicit racially biased. And he sort of knows about him. He just doesn't, it's also true of him that he doesn't know that he has implicit bias. But he's in an epistemic environment where you can make a case, yeah, you probably should have known. You knew about the very idea or the concept. You should go out and make adjustments and precautions. So again, given the psychological facts, this is very similar to the slide I just put up for Jane. Given the psychological facts about John Doe, together with the social role he occupied, again, it's not necessarily everyone, but the fact that he's on a hiring committee, he should know about these things because he's in a social role to which they are sort of very much relevant. I think of them as gatekeeper social roles. So the relevant content of his moral ecology and epistemic environment, which is very different than Jane's in 1980. But again, the analogy still holds here. John does in fact satisfy one of these ignorant-based exculpating conditions, not aware that he has implicit biases, not aware how they're influencing his judgments when he's serving on this hiring committee. But it's reasonable to blame him because he could have been aware and he should have been aware. So he's like the student who didn't know about the midterm. You should have known about the midterm. The information was there, and given the social role that you were in, or he was in, he should have known about it. So in this case, the exception clause is also satisfied, and we should blame and hold him responsible. And again, this is a function. Basically what's happening inside his head is very similar to what's happening inside Jane's head. But what's different, what's clearly different, is the epistemic environment, the contents of his moral ecology. We know much more about implicit biases now. The information's out there. It's available. It certainly seems morally relevant. This is one way to assign it that kind of moral significance. So John is responsible, and he deserves blame for failing to take precautions and for allowing his implicit biases to influence his deliberations. They're the exception clauses which are being satisfied. All right, so that's the intuition pump, and then just sort of tie some of the pieces together, and then I'll be done. So shaping the moral ecology. So here's a way maybe to walk into, and you can see if you're resistant to this, where you want to throw on the brakes. So basically a general, uncontroversial claim: knowledge can influence moral responsibility. It's sort of what's built into the idea that there's these exculpation clauses which take knowledge to be the key factor of any individual in their situation. And so changes in knowledge can lead to changes in moral responsibility. It seems like it would be straightforward. Maybe a more specific claim: features of a person's moral ecology and the epistemic context in which they're operating, which they're acting, can affect what she can be reasonably held responsible for, what she can be reasonably blamed for. And this includes what social role he or she occupies, and this also includes, and this is a little bit controversial amongst some philosophers anyway, this also includes the current state of what we know about the mind and how it works, or sort of what we think the facts of human psychology are and what the empirical research is showing. So the responsibility relevant features of any person's situation can include the norms that are present in her culture, specifically maybe those that apply to particular social roles. But of course, these can evolve and these can be changed. Norms sort of shift with time. Sometimes it's guided, sometimes it's just evolution. Can also change with the content of her social and epistemic environment, especially knowledge about how our minds work. And this also is sort of growing, it's increasing. And it can change with access to better strategies for how to take control of implicit biases and how to better manage one's own behavior so that it better expresses your actual values. And these strategies are sort of improving as well. So here's a sort of catchy, maybe a little bit sloppy, but you can put this on a t-shirt easily, and it resonates with some other stuff that's happened in philosophy. Responsibility ain't in the head, or at least more precisely, not all of the responsibility, or sorry, not all of the knowledge relevant to exculpation, blame, and responsibility is in the head of the agent whose actions are being evaluated. So again, in the cases of Jane and John Doe, the relevant informational asymmetry was mostly in the social context. You put them in different social contexts, put them in different external environment, and the epistemic aspects of their moral ecology was what was really different. And if you buy the analysis that John was responsible in a way that Jane wasn't, that's what's doing it. That's what's sort of pushing your intuition. Importantly, the differences, a lot of these differences were the result of sustained empirical psychological research. The fact that we know about implicit biases now. And these facts seem to matter. They enrich our moral ecology. So they can, the growing epistemic understanding of the way our minds work in a way that's sort of antithetical to the worry that Barge expressed earlier. It's helping us raise the standards for responsibility and blame. So the take-home message, this is wrong sometimes. I hope at least I've convinced you that there are circumstances where people can and should be blamed for implicit bias influenced actions, even if they don't know they have them. And that's because of the different moral ecologies they might inhabit. And if you come back to this sort of depiction of the main worry, It's not that there's this sort of unbreakable or smooth connection between the exculpating condition for knowledge. We can know about implicit biases. We know them indirectly. We don't just introspect. It's not the way we typically gain knowledge of our own minds, portrayed by folk psychology, but they are knowable. What about that one? Haven't said much about that, so I'll just sort of point at it very quickly. It's the subject of another series of papers and sort of where I'm heading with this research at this point. But I mentioned before that implicit biases are recalcitrant. They operate outside of and sometimes despite our attempts to consciously control them in various ways. But I also flagged this issue, and I kind of said, yeah, but it's not that they're just utterly rigid. It's not that they're completely malleable. It's just that the ways that have been shown to successfully mitigate their influence or sort of get indirect control of them aren't what you would immediately think. It's something which psychology, the empirical work there, has been illuminating in various ways. So the paper I wrote with Jules, one of my co-authors, explored this sort of sense of control which is required, which works when it comes to sort of gaining ways to take responsibility and take control of our implicit biases. And what we argue there is that the sense of control is there's nothing wrong with the kind of control that we can take. It's a little bit harder. It's a little bit more indirect. Sometimes it involves rearranging different parts of our epistemic environment in various ways to make it easier for us to act in ways which align with our explicit values. Sometimes it's just something as easy as sort of tricking yourself or practicing a cognitive skill, which are called. So these are the names of some of the techniques that have been shown to work, these implementation intentions. And if you just practice a little bit beforehand, you can sort of break the connection between seeing something which typically activates your implicit bias and the bad negative response that you usually have. So again, it's not that I haven't talked or made a big argument about that, but that is also, there's reason to think, not a straightforward problem because implicit biases are in fact indirectly controllable. So the cognitive monster goes away, rainbows and unicorns. So just a concluding remarks here. So the picture here, the way I think about the implications of this fairly simple thought experiment, and maybe hopefully an intuition that is not hard to grasp and that a lot of you share, is that the epistemic and the effective pathways to influence implicit biases. And this is pitched for this talk in terms of what we should blame ourselves for or what we should hold ourselves responsible for. But you can sort of flip it and look at it the other way so it's not so dreary, like we're all to blame because we have these terrible... So one thing is that the way the empirical work is unfolding is it's showing us, yeah, that we tend to have these implicit biases, but it's also showing ourselves how we can free ourselves from the influence of these implicit biases so we're not sort of constrained or coerced by these weird, creepy facts in our psychology. But the way to do that, the epistemology of freeing ourselves from these psychological facts is not going to be sort of standard. It's not going to be introspective. It's not going to be pure volition. It's going to run outside of our heads. It's the most effective ways to do it is to reshape our moral ecology, reshape what's happening external to our heads. That was the main difference between John and Jane. So it needs to be especially sensitive, this is a theme of a lot of my research, to what's happening in the empirical psychological labs. Like, we need to listen to what the psychologists are telling us if what we want to do is sort of figure out the best way to be the kinds of people we want to be, if we want to figure out the best way to act morally by our own lights. And so the upshot here is that the best way to take responsibility for and control of our implicit biases is from the outside in. Next.
I was just wondering if you could say a bit more by way of characterizing how you understand your disagreement with Jennifer Saul. So the way I'm taking, the takeaway for me is that it looks like the disagreement is at the empirical level rather than at the normative or the philosophical level about what the norms of responsibility are. And that so that, in other words, her comment about it not making sense to hold people responsible for their implicit biases was based on the assumption that these biases are either outside our knowledge or recalcitrant in a really robust way. Right. And then what you're showing is that if they, so it's consistent with at least what you've said out loud today, that if they really were like that, then you would agree with Saul that it wouldn't make sense to hold us responsible, but that it turns out that they're not like that in various ways. And I'm curious if that is, in fact, the takeaway, that you think that it's that the disagreement is at that empirical level?
I mean, so I think there's a really sharp way. If I take Jen for what she said, Jennifer, for what she says at her word, there's a disagreement, because what she says is, look, if you have someone who is just unaware that they have implicit bias, that person shouldn't be held responsible. And what I'm saying is that's not always true, because there's some places where you can justifiably say, yeah, I know. I've talked to people like this. I know you don't know whether or not you have implicit biases, but you should know. It's your problem, and I can hold you responsible, and I can blame you for doing something sort of morally amiss or not living up to your own professed standards by not finding out. And I think that's important, because I think it's sort of a way to bootstrap standards. So another thing you said was, and this is largely correct, what I take us to be doing is sort of expressing these norms which are out there already. But also what I want to do is I want the arguments to be in favor of, shaping the moral ecology. Here's the way that we should take these fairly standard norms of how we hold ourselves responsible, and here's how we should extend them to this set of cases, where it's not always clear and certainly not everyone disagrees. So it's not just that I'm taking the norms as they are and then applying them. I'm also sort of what some of my political scientist friends call a norm entrepreneur. Of like, and here's how you should extend this one to these tough cases.
Hi, first of all, thank you very much for the talk. I find it particularly interesting, because not only because I'm German, I'm also in HR. So I've been on many of these committees. It's very square to say to people, think about your potential biases, think about responsibilities and stuff like that. How do you get these into pretty much lazy people who simply can't be bothered?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing, I guess, man, if I knew how to do this, I'd be making $1 million with Tony Robbins or something. With the way I'm thinking about it is there are people out there, yes, they're lazy, right? But a lot of times their sort of explicit heart is in the right place. And so they, like with John Doe, we take him at his word. He doesn't like racism. He's egalitarian. He thinks you just, you kind of shame him into it a little bit. Or another line of research that we're talking about going with this is how to think not about sort of moral responsibility assigned to individuals. The way you sort of get them to comply with these norms is the way, when you're not working with institutional apparatus, you get any individual to try and comply with the relevant tacit norms. Is you just kind of, you yell at them a little bit, you shame them a little bit, you gossip at them a little bit, whatever the mechanisms of punishment are that operate on sort of a sub-institutional level that govern the way we interact with each other. That's all I got for you, right? But I feel the worry there that maybe that's not going to be enough, and people are really busy, even the well-meaning ones. So the next step here is to think about how to bring theories of responsibility to bear effectively, not on individuals who make up committees, but on the institutions that determine how committees should be made up and how they should process this information, which is not easy. But even in my department, we're trying to figure out a way to anonymize application packets, right? Just take the names off, right? And if you don't, but that's not easy, because then you're reading letters of recommendation, and those use gendered pronouns, and but people are thinking about this, and even how to hold institutions responsible if they fail to take on measures to try and mitigate implicit biases. That's where we want to go with this next. That's a great question.
I guess the main difference between your opinion and Jane's, right, is that she points to the exculpating condition of not knowing, right? And I guess the novelty of your work is that you're then pointing at the exclusion clause that tells you, yes, but you should have known, right? And it seems to me that you can easily go down a rabbit hole where you also find exculpating conditions to the exception conditions. So like in the example you gave about the student missing the midterm, you could say, the midterm was only advertised in a very particular medium, like a website, and the student doesn't have access to the website. And then how do you? And then it seemed that you suggested that the way you know when to stop is to say, well, this is a reasonable place to stop. But it seems to me then that that is a very subjective thing, and that 20 years from now we're going to be 3 or 4 layers down that rabbit hole, saying, So like, how do you manage that?
So I want to make sure I have the analogy clear. So the student says, well, I didn't know about the midterm. I say you were supposed to know about the midterm. The student says, well, it was only on the website, and I didn't have access to the website because my computer crashed. How do you mitigate that? Well, you make sure that at the beginning of the class they have the syllabus and you hand it out. I mean, you sort of use a multiple attack strategy, right? You sort of have backup plans upon backup plans with the student, right? How to take that, how to analogize to someone like John Doe. Oh, I didn't know about implicit bias. I say you should have known about your implicit bias because we kind of know that these are a thing now. It's part of the ambient epistemic environment for those of us who are sitting on sort of gatekeeper hiring committees should know about it. And then he says, well, I was really busy this week, or I just didn't have time to take that IAT, and then your question is, where do you stop there?
Right, yeah, so like you could even, I'm guessing this is actually where your next work is gonna go, where you're talking about, maybe say this is John Doe 2.0, and he did try to stop them, and he did 2 or 3 of these exercises, but they weren't enough.
Right.
So like where you call that reasonable or not reasonable is like iffy to me.
So I mean, the one thing I'll say is basically a concession. So where this reasonable cutoff is so maybe John Doe has enough excuses that he gets out of the blame. But I think that's also a moving boundary, right? And part of what is happening as the moral ecology sort of shapes and gets richer, and this becomes more of a thing which is being taken into account by institutions, which is being publicized, where there's people giving talks about it. That line for what's acceptable and what isn't, the standards are getting higher. And it's a slow process, but I think that's the right way to think about what's happening here. And if what you want to do is make it, like if what we want to do is stop the effects of implicit biases, then what you can do is sort of help push that process forward, help shape the moral ecology in whatever ways you have at your disposal.
Hi. One of the tricky parts about your argumentation is that bias persists as much as it does because of the ambiguity of the situations in which it happens. And so if I kind of take your metaphor about like the sleepwalking cookie eater or the person who missed the exam, I mean, if you're to map that onto the situation of bias, that would require John, for example, the present day John, to say, yes, I acted on biases, but I'm not responsible for them because the biases are operating at some implicit uncontrollable level. But there's not a single person I can think of who would agree that their biased behavior was a function of their biases, because there's always a non-biased explanation for why they behaved the way they did. And actually, a lot of the studies that you presented, that were your textbook facts for the existence of implicit biases effects are exactly those kinds of. I mean, that data exists because of the ambiguity of the circumstances. And the Mullainathan study in particular,
Bertrand, yeah.
It's people would none of those people, if you were to ask them, would say I acted based on biases. They would all say I acted because they just weren't as good candidates or what have you.
Right.
So I'm wondering, like, I'm trying to fit your question about responsibility within this just fact that people will never admit that they are biased, even though their actions may be the result of bias.
Right. So the human propensity to confabulate is nearly unbounded, is another way to think about this. And if you ask, there's a huge research line on this. Goes back to Wilson and Nisbet. I'm sure you know about all this. Right. So I mean, the first thing to say might be, a lot of those excuses that they give for their own behavior, they're false. They misdescribe the sources of their own behavior, the psychological springs of why they make the judgment that they do or that they don't. And the second thing, it's a tough issue. I mean, this is another one of these issues that philosophers are really wrestling with at this point. But another thing might be to say, look, take a step back from any individual episode of behavior and say, look, I know I have implicit biases. I know the general sort of profile of how this is going to affect various behaviors that I take. And so I'm going to sit down and sort of do these implementation intentions, or I'm going to anonymize my kids' tests when they turn them in, or I'm going to do what I can Because I know that in general, maybe not in this particular activity or this particular action or this one, I know in general, implicit biases are likely to sort of skew my behavior in a way that I don't want it to be skewed. So I can rearrange my environment in such a way. I can put up pictures of Denzel Washington and Obama. This is another technique that's been shown to work. That if you found that you have an implicit bias against, for instance, African Americans, if you just do something as simple as surround yourself or like put in your office, hang a picture of a respected member of whatever race you have implicit biases against, it'll like tone it down a little bit. And it's this sort of stuff that just sounds so stupid, but it works. So if I know I have implicit bias, I can take these sort of steps, and I won't know which particular actions are being influenced by implicit biases, but I can take sort of a more indirect route to try and mitigate their influence across the board.
Okay, so I can see, so your argument is more one of inoculation as opposed to sort of blame, maybe. Not after the fact.
Right, so inoculating yourself in these ways is, I think that would give you the resources to, if there was some particular instance where you did something that you didn't like and you're blamed and you have implicit bias, I think that would inoculate you against being reasonably blamed or held responsible for that particular action. If you say, look, I did what I'm supposed to do. I put up pictures of Denzel and Obama. I've done these implementation intentions. It still happened in this case where I had to make a split decision. I hate that, but I did the things I was supposed to do, right? And I think that's a legitimate thing to say. If you've made that kind of effort, you can't hit all the moles, right, or all the whack-a-moles, but you can make an effort.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a quick comment on the conflict that could occur from people trying to balance between the rules of life, rules of business, rules of sports, rules of law, and the moral ecology. So you want to be result-oriented, but at the same time, you have to take care of the evolution of your moral ecology. How do you really tackle this?
Yeah, that's pretty close to how do I lead a good life, right? Which is a great question. Here's what I'll say on that. I think it's beholden on a lot of us to kind of do the best we can, and for a lot of people who are in universities and who are coming to these talks, we can do more to try and satisfy the demands of morality than someone has to work in a coal mine or lives their life under like horrendously burdensome circumstances. So I think that factors into it. I also think that philosophers are attracted to this idea that if you imagine someone who is actually a moral saint, who actually complied with all and only the demands of morality at the expense of other elements of life, family life, or pursuit of personal interests, there's something kind of creepy about that sort of personality, right? So we're all making these decisions, right? There's the demands of morality, but then there's other demands, and we care about these things in different ways, and we have to sort of make a lot of command decisions on how to proportion out our time. Again, the argument I gave here, and this came up with the sort of Nazi back and forth, the argument I gave here is there's people out there who I think are honestly sort of egalitarian, and they would like the world to be a more just and anti-racist place. And what I was thinking about here is how do we bring the tools of sort of moral responsibility to bear on getting them to put a little bit more effort into it. Even it's not really hard to just take an IAT and see if you have these things and do a couple implementation intentions. And to the extent that there's those of us who care more about this issue than some other issues, this is how we can start making other people care about the issue that we care about, right? Do some consciousness raising, do some talking about moral responsibility in a way which might speak to them given the way they already think about moral responsibility.